all of you. Welcome to those of you in the room. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We are filming today, so if anybody has any problems with that, please make yourself known to the film crew and they will make sure that you're not in any of the video edits. So I am Dr. Matt Davis. I'm the acting director of the McDonald Institute, and I am absolutely honoured today to introduce David Wengrow, Professor of Comparative Archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London, to give this evening's 35th McDonald annual lecture with the title, What Might an Archaeology of Freedom Look Like? These annual lectures are, I think, a fabulous opportunity for our intellectual community to come together, to share our thoughts, and perhaps later maybe share a little wine as well, and to be inspired to celebrate great ideas and great thinkers in our field. And it is heartwarming to see such a vibrant and esteemed audience gathered this evening. And I believe that tonight's lecture will provide something of a tonic. So as we consider the sad events, conflicts, and forms of unfreedom that are unfolding around the world, it seems to me both timely for us to reflect on the privilege that we all hold in being able to debate the field of archaeology, as well as the potential for our fields to inspire alternative ways of being and living within the world. So tonight's speaker is very much a pioneer of such reimagining. David's work, and most notably the landmark book authored with the late David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything, offers a significant reinterpretation of our understanding of human history and of the myths that we tell ourselves about that history. The book explores important themes, including the diversity of social and political forms in human history, the nature of inequality and freedom, the form and purpose of the state, and our own teleological understandings of progress. In doing a little research for this introduction, I was very impressed by how many contemporary actors, thinkers, and elements of the popular press beyond archaeology had engaged with the book. Clearly, audiences beyond our own field find in the book inspiration for reimagining not just the past, but also for our present and our future. And as David was telling me yesterday, some of the most exciting developments that he feels that have come from the book have been the essays and articles penned by others who use the book as a catalyst for contemporary debates on issues such as the environment, democracy, equality, and indeed, as we will hear, freedom. And as David Graeber has stated, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently. So the core contribution of their work is then, I think, to offer inspiration and source material for this remaking. David's accolades are numerous. He has been a visiting professor in New York, in Auckland, and in Freiburg, and was awarded the Albert Magnus Professorship by the University of Cologne. He is a recipient of the Antiquity Prize and has delivered the Jack Dooley Lectures at the Max Planck Institute, the Henry Myers Lecture at the Royal Anthropological Institute, and the Radcliffe Brown Lecture at the British Academy. Among many achievements, The Dawn of Everything was, of course, an international bestseller, only just, but quite understandably, picked to the #1 spot by the Fresh Prince himself, Mr. Will Smith. It was a close call, I'm sure, but The Dawn of Everything did thankfully beat Mr. Smith to a spot as a finalist for the Orwell Prize for Political Writing in 2022. David has authored 3 other major books, The Archaeology of Early Egypt, What Makes Civilization, and The Origin of Monsters, alongside numerous articles and essays. So tonight, I believe that we're going to hear more from David on his thinking that has emerged since the dawn of everything, and I'm sure that we're in for a treat. And David, we're delighted and honoured that you are able to join us, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on the archaeology of freedom. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthew. My old teacher, Andrew Sherratt, wrote once that, let me get this right, the writing of prehistory is still a dialogue with the ghost of Gordon Childe, and this talk will be no exception. The concept of freedom was central to Childe's vision of prehistory, and in particular his understanding of prehistoric Europe. It's quite clear that Childe's larger reconstruction of human history, explored in books like Man Makes Himself, What Happened in History, and the Prehistory of European Society, was ultimately devoted to tracing a Bronze Age origin for principles of social and economic organization that set Europe on a distinctive course from the rest of the world. The argument was spatial and it was dialectical in its logic. It hinged on an interpretation of the origins and spread of complex metalworking. What Childe argued, in brief, is that the development of metallurgy required social conditions that, to begin with, could only be achieved in cities, specifically a complex division of labor supported by surplus accumulation of wealth. This happened not in Europe, but in what Childe in the 1930s could still refer to as the ancient Orient, where, according to him, society became organized on rigid principles of social class and religious authority. But to obtain sources of copper, tin, and other raw materials, the great river valley civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia were also obliged to look outwards, generating networks of supply and demand that eventually reached beyond the shores of the Black Sea to the Danube, where European communities, as well as being much smaller in scale, were organized on very different principles, which fostered social competition and innovation rather than conformity. In such settings, Childe surmised, the creators of metal products could not be tied down to a single chief or a single ruler, and chiefs had to accept this, since they needed access to those products for warfare or industry. As a social class, skilled artisans therefore remained distinct, free, and mobile, which also liberated them from what Childe referred to as the more rigid fetters of tribal custom, because they could see that things were done differently in different places. As many modern commentators on Childe's intellectual legacy have noted, what we've got here is really a projection back into prehistory of a 19th century contrast between the supposed stagnation of Oriental despotism and the supposed dynamism of Western freedoms. As my UCL colleague Mike Rowlands notes in an essay called Childe and the Archaeology of Freedom, in a classic version of Marxist ontology, the freedom of European Bronze Age smiths to seek work and outlets for their products free from political constraint inverts the social conditions of production in Oriental despotism and patronage by court elites. By representing Greek metics and medieval wayfarers and journeymen as the heirs of Bronze Age smiths, a grand sociological history of freedom is concocted by Childe. For Childe, then, the birth of cities in the ancient Near East was an incubator for technological innovations, but also authoritarian institutions that prevented their application to progressive social ends, or as Childe himself put it, in terms redolent of Marx, non-agricultural professionals in Bronze Age Europe preserved their traditional freedoms unimpaired. But their freedom, we must repeat, was possible and actual just because the urban revolution had previously taken place in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And it goes on, the extractive industries and distributive systems that served the Aegean craftsmen had been built up by reliance on Oriental capital. Now, it seems unlikely today that any serious scholar of European prehistory, let alone of the Middle East, would seek to defend Childe's reconstruction. But Rowlands, I think, is not alone among recent commentators in finding themselves attracted to a broader notion that the study of the past has to be, in some sense, liberating. Childe's notion of a Neolithic or agricultural revolution as marking the beginnings of surplus accumulation, triggering an urban revolution, the birth of social classes, and leading ultimately to industrial modernity, has long formed the backbone of social evolutionism in its modern form, and probably still constitutes most people's notion of the broad sweep of human history, at least until recently. Academic critiques of this scheme, based of course on a wealth of data unavailable to Childe, have emphasized, for example, the complexity of pre-agricultural societies, the protracted, that is to say, non-revolutionary nature of plant and animal domestication in various parts of the world, and the institutional diversity of early cities. But arguably, these aspects of Childe's thought under scrutiny there were really the backdrop to his main concern, which was in fact to develop an archaeology of freedom that by contrast has gone almost entirely without comment in the more recent literature, other than retrospective condemnations of Childe's Orientalism by intellectual historians and biographers. So the purpose of my lecture this evening, and thank you so much for this invitation, it's really a great honor and really having a wonderful time here in Cambridge. The purpose of the lecture today is to ask what might an archaeology of freedom, shorn of those kinds of Eurocentric assumptions, look like today. And to get things in motion, it might be worth pointing out that what was almost certainly wrong for Europe may eventually turn out to be right, or at least not completely wrong, for other parts of the world and other key moments of transition in human, social, and technological development. Earlier this year, in an article for the journal History and Technology, the title of the article is Black Metallurgists in the Making of the Industrial Revolution, my other UCL colleague, the historian of science, Jenny Bulstrode, presented an audacious case that the method of converting scrap metal into valuable iron bars, called rolling and puddling, which was patented in 1783 by the English industrialist Henry Court and became pivotal to the Industrial Revolution, was in fact pioneered by enslaved West African metalsmiths on a colonial foundry in Jamaica, adapting techniques which they carried over from the ironworking traditions of equatorial Africa, and the court, celebrated after his death as the father of the iron trade, stole the idea from them. In making her case, Bulstrode notes, and I quote, that an estimated 75% of the people transported from the Bight of Biafra to the Americas between 1640 and 1800 were taken from Igbo land, with the majority from this northern region most renowned for its ironworking skill, where a long tradition existed of industrial ironworking complexes, serving also as places of refuge for people uprooted or displaced from their natal surroundings, and as hubs for the exchange of ideas within a wider zone of great linguistic diversity. Historically, she notes, West Africa and Central Africa constitute a region where Proto-Bantu stem words for forge and smith are shared. Specialist ironsmiths tended to be itinerant and multilingual, in a manner that Childe might have recognized, traveling routinely over long distances and often serving as conduits of interregional exchange. Here, perhaps, we have the beginnings of a new and far more hybrid reconstruction of the roots of industrial modernity, in which it is ultimately a form of social freedom, based on principles of mobility, asylum, and relative autonomy from the coercive power of kings and chiefs that fosters technological change. If Bulstrode is even half correct, and her thesis about Henry Court's patent, I should note, has already attracted some scholarly controversy, but if she's even half correct, then the consequences were not just confined to West African societies, but played out on a truly global scale. In the main part of this lecture, I want to try and sketch the outlines of a broader answer to my question: what might an archaeology archaeology of freedom look like, extending ideas put forward in the book that I co-authored with the anthropologist David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything. Childe, of course, had his own dawn, the dawn of European civilization, later known simply as the dawn, and while exploring a common theme of freedom, I would stress the obvious implications of a shift from European civilization to everything. I'll also try and suggest that the answer to the question has to do, in a quite literal sense, with how the archaeological record increasingly looks to us now, as opposed to in the days of Childe, or what another Marxist critic, John Berger, might have called our contemporary ways of seeing. In our dawn, David Graeber and I described three basic forms of human freedom, which I've already touched on in my discussion of Childe, this understanding of ancient methodology, and the more recent work of Wengrow. We argue that far from being a special achievement of Western civilization, these freedoms were available to a great number of human societies across the entire span of history, extending back into our species' deep past. We also argue that today, these same freedoms have become largely erased from the lives of most people on the planet, to the extent that it is difficult for most of us now to even imagine what it might mean to live in a world based on these principles. The three freedoms I refer to are the freedom to move away, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to reshuffle our social arrangements in more than trivial ways. The existence and reproduction of these freedoms is necessarily grounded in particular sets of historical and material circumstances, and so is their breakdown or erosion. In fact, the erasure of these three basic forms of human freedom is, we suggest, a relatively recent feature of world history. It can only be understood in the context of the last half millennium or so of land enclosure, mass enslavement, colonial plunder, and spiraling wars of genocide and destruction, accompanied by the growth of new regimes of private property, credit, and debt, along with systems of territorial sovereignty and surveillance that would have been beyond the wildest dreams of any Bronze Age ruler or Iron Age emperor. Of course, the last 500 years or so have also witnessed the global rise of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, and the growth of representative democracy in various parts of the world. We may be tempted to see a paradox here. How can the rise of democracy be coeval with an unprecedented loss of human freedoms? It is precisely this paradox that works with such self-explanatory titles as Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, or Michael Mann's The Dark Side of Democracy, Explaining Ethnic Cleansing, or Tyler Stovall's White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, or indeed David Graeber's own brilliant essay, There Never Was a West, or Democracy Emerges from the Spaces in Between, have done so much to clarify and dispel. They oblige us to recall the human cost of modern capitalism and industrialization, to remember the many local and indigenous forms of direct democracy that were eradicated to make way for representative democracies in the service of expanding nation states and corporations. They ask us to remember how, from the mid-19th century onwards, the self-identification of European powers as free and democratic went hand in hand with their largely unqualified, economically motivated support of regimes that were actively suppressing democratic reform among much larger populations overseas, sowing the seeds of so many contemporary crises. And they ask us to reflect on how all of this relates to the erosion of freedoms inside our own democracies, reducing those freedoms to largely transactional values: the freedom to expand one's purchasing power, to defend one's property, or to sell one's labor to the highest bidder. For all these reasons, it's important to underscore that the three freedoms we define in the Dawn of Everything are not simply individual freedoms. Freedoms conceived in purely individualistic terms can quickly morph into sort of micro forms of domination and already assume the existence of an infrastructure of punishment and coercion to enforce them. Nor are we talking about freedom as an abstract concept. We're talking about concrete social freedoms, which also enable the freedom of others, which is to say they presuppose the existence of a different kind of material infrastructure to that of the state, and a different sort of morality to the morality of capitalism, with its familiar atomizing effects. The first freedom to move away from one's surroundings can only become a lived reality if there exist robust networks of hospitality and asylum through which individuals can move, finding shelter and protection along the way. One of the clearest illustrations of this that David and I came across is the concept and practice called Wunan, developed by Indigenous thinkers in northwestern Australia. And I should add that we didn't actually find room for this example in the book. We've gone over everything and had intended to learn a lot more about it for inclusion perhaps within some future sequel or something. As it turns out, Wunan is a concept of enormous complexity. European anthropologists used the term to refer to two apparently quite different things. First, a system of image making, comprising paintings on natural rock surfaces distributed across the ancestral landscapes of the West Kimberley. And second, a system of what we might call hospitality zones, traversed by Indigenous people from some hundreds of different communities. In anthropological parlance, this forms a web of overlapping clans and moieties which outspan local groups, ensuring that everyone has potential hosts in distant places. In the course of asserting their native title over the land, Guyrian intellectuals have recently made a point of explaining to Western researchers and lawyers that Wunan actually means even more than this. Above all, they emphasize it is a code of law, a code that is impressed on the landscape through the medium of images, which can only be learnt by moving through it. At the same time, it is also, and I quote, a set of prescriptive and proscriptive rules of civilized behavior, the most prized possession of a Guyrian adult. And I'm quoting here from a senior lawman, the late David Mawaljalai, who argued explicitly that Aboriginal civilization is built on this particular combination of aesthetic, topographic, and moral principles, which he contrasted with the economic and extractive principles that govern settlers' relationship with the land. Similarly, the second freedom to disobey arbitrary commands can only become the basis of a functional social order when accompanied by the cultivation of other psychological and personality traits which tend towards toleration, persuasion, and reasoned argumentation. In Dawn of Everything, we explored the historical case of encounters between European colonizers and the indigenous societies of the eastern woodlands of North America, specifically the Great Lakes region. Jesuit missionaries such as Gabriel Sagal, whose 1632 work, Le Grand Voyage du Pays des Hurons, influenced Locke and Voltaire, often marveled at the facility of native people for skilled oratory and debate, while at the same time being openly hostile to the obvious freedom and even playfulness of their social arrangements. How could such facilities for reasoned argumentation possibly have come from those with no awareness of words of valor and quintillion? In considering the matter, Jesuits almost always noted the openness with which public affairs were conducted. So writes Father Lejeune in the 1630s, quote, there were almost none of them incapable of conversing or reasoning very well and in good terms on matters within their knowledge. Their councils, held almost every day in the villages and on almost all matters, improved their capacity for talking. Roughly 10 years later, it was Lejeune again, writing in 1642, who most clearly perceived the logical connection between the reasoned debate, personal freedoms, and the refusal of arbitrary power. They imagine, he wrote about the Montagnese Scapi, that they ought by right of birth to enjoy the liberty of wild ass-colts, rendering no homage to anyone whomsoever except when they like. They have reproached me 100 times because we fear our captives, while they laugh at and make sport of theirs. All the authority of their chief is in his tongue's end, for he is powerful only insofar as he is eloquent, and even if he kills himself talking and haranguing, he will not be obeyed unless he pleases savages. Now, at least some Jesuits clearly recognize here an intrinsic relationship between what we call perceptive freedom, to disobey, and a taste for reasoned argument, accompanied by open and inclusive political debate. And this fact alone seems to have had important repercussions, because it seems to be exactly this style of debate, rational, empirical, skeptical, and conversational in tone, which before long came to be identified with the European Enlightenment as well, traveling west from the Americas, along with such all-consuming habits as smoking tobacco from pipes and socializing with caffeinated beverages. And of course, Enlightenment thinkers also saw it as intrinsically connected to the rejection of arbitrary authority, especially the authority assumed by the clergy. Historians and ethnographers, from Francis Laflèche to Willard Rawlings, have noted how, in the history of the American Midwest, migration was often conceived as the restructuring of an entire social order, merging the three elementary freedoms into a single project of emancipation, to move away, to disobey, and to build new social worlds. What now we would call social movements often took the form quite literally of movements through a landscape, if such freedoms existed until relatively recently among people forced to survive in the dwindling cracks of the modern world system. How then should we imagine the greater part of human history before the expansion of racial capitalism and imperial systems of domination? One of the main arguments of the dawn of everything is that for some time now, the writing of human history and social science on a large scale, the creation of what we might call grand narratives, has converged around a simple task, which is to stop us from imagining those kinds of things at all, rather confine our imaginations to a series of stark alternatives or false binaries, were we originally egalitarian, hierarchical, cooperative, competitive, kind and selfish, and so on, which actually make it impossible to even perceive, let alone understand, the true complexities of human social life outside the canonical history of states and empires, as they increasingly reveal themselves to us through archaeological science and other modern methods of investigation. Now, by this time, you may quite reasonably be asking yourself how it is possible to study something like freedom in past societies when the only evidence of social life available to us may be material traces in the landscape, or prehistoric images, burials, buildings, tools, ornaments, and other artifacts. In answer to which, I would make the maybe obvious point that archaeologists experience no such difficulty studying systems of domination and control in equally remote periods of human history using exactly the same kinds of evidence. We might begin by looking at those cases in the archaeological record where we are faced with evidence of humans doing something other than running for their chains, such as running away from them, for example. Confronted with such evidence, our current lack of a theoretical vocabulary often, I think, leaves us a bit tongue-tied or obliges us to revert to the language of chaos and collapse, which is not to say that such things never happened. Some civilizations certainly have collapsed, at least in demographic terms. It's simply to insist that we shouldn't treat such categories as our default mode of explanation, especially when there's no particular empirical justification for doing so. To take just one example, the archaeological record of the Middle East, where Childe saw only Oriental despotism, these days presents a far more complex picture of the relationship between urbanization and the emergence of class stratification, monarchy, and courtly societies. Consider the 4.5 hectare site of Arslan Tepe, located 1,000 meters above sea level on the Malatya plain of eastern Turkey. Here, on this rather small mound, really the scale of a village rather than a city, archaeologists, led by Marcello Frangipane of the Sapienza University in Rome, have uncovered what is plausibly identified, I think, as the earliest known palace complex in the Middle East, or even anywhere in the world, dating to the later part of the 4th millennium BC, which is long before any such palatial architecture is attested in urban centres to the south. This suggests the precocious emergence in a decidedly non-urban highland setting of courtly societies of a type that would only become widespread in the cities of the Mesopotamian floodplain about 5 centuries later, during the early dynastic period. This palace building at Arslan Tepe covers an area of 4,000 square meters, incorporating an audience hall, private sanctuary, and rooms for storage, food preparation, and administration. It also produced this unique assemblage of finely crafted swords and spearheads, pointing, quite literally, to the existence of an organized militia capable of imposing their will or the will of the sovereign. But strikingly, the expansion of the palace complex between 3,300 and roughly 3,100 BC actually sees a reduction in the overall population of Arslan Tepe, as people apparently dispersed outward, away from the new institution onto the surrounding plain. So the settlement actually shrinks, and its end appears to have been sudden, with no obvious evidence of associated climatic or other environmental change. We see something a little bit similar centuries later at the site of Mari, modern Tel Hariri, on the Syrian Euphrates. In that case, the arrival of an authoritarian ruler from outside the city appears to have sent urban life into reverse. Such was the case with the Amorite dynasty of the Lims, Yagid, Yahdun, and Zimri, which conquered much of the region and set up their center of operations in the already ancient city of Mari. Their arrival seems to have precipitated a mass exodus of Mari's urban population, who left to join up with smaller townships or tent-dwelling herders scattered across the Syrian steppe. Before the sack of Mari by Hammurabi of Babylon in 1761 BC, the last city of the Amorite kings comprised little more than a royal residence, a harem, attached temples, and a handful of other official buildings. To construct an archaeology of freedom, I suggest we need a terminology for this sort of process to match our extensive lexicon for systems of hegemony and centralization. For those who favor systems theory, I think Carol Crumley's pioneering application of the concept of heterarchy remains a key source. But the challenge, I suggest, goes beyond what words alone can achieve to the very methods by which we obtain and represent archaeological data, including the use of visual and computational methods. And with that in mind, I want to finish my lecture by talking briefly about a new collaboration which I began shortly after the publication of The Dawn of Everything, and which culminated in an exhibition at the 18th Biennale of Architecture in Venice. The exhibition, which opened in May and actually just closed this month, though we think it's moving somewhere else, is called the Nebelivka hypothesis. It takes as its focus the much debated phenomenon of the Tripilia megasites, massive settlements dating to the 4th millennium BC, located in the steppe forest ecotone of central Ukraine, and specifically the site of Nebelivka in the countryside between the Bug and Dnieper rivers near the modern city of Uman, where a geomagnetic survey undertaken between 2011 and 2013 produced this fairly comprehensive plan of the settlement. It's basically ovoid form and radial circumferences of houses, or this is easier on this side, organized around an apparently empty center. Our project is concerned with interrogating the nature of evidence and argumentation, which goes to make up contemporary understandings of urban life, its origins, nature, and future possibilities. We're interested in bringing to the surface a process of sorting and negation by which the status of city is either recorded or denied to certain kinds of human settlement. And obviously a term like megasite, as conventionally applied to these Ukrainian settlements, is one of several archaeological euphemisms, clearly intended to signal their failure to meet the status of fully urban civilization. It is a sensitive point, which has generated a good deal of heat, but perhaps not that much light in the scientific literature, because the Ukrainian megasites are almost precisely contemporaneous with the onset of Golden Child's urban revolution in the Middle East, dating the 4th millennium BC. Not only that, but in terms of spatial extent, their remains cover an area that is as large, or in some cases considerably larger, than the earliest cities in Mesopotamia, for which ancient Uruk has long served as a type site. So just to give a sense of scale, this is roughly the size of medieval London. And I just quickly draw your attention to the fact that we still know almost nothing whatsoever about habitation areas or domestic architecture at Uruk, although nobody seems to have any hesitation about calling that a city. Unlike Uruk, the Tripilia megasites of Ukraine exhibit little evidence of centralization. Based on the analysis of their geomagnetic plan, archaeologists like Chapman and Gaidaska have proposed that their organization, their social organization, was of a robustly egalitarian nature, settlement divided into neighborhoods, each with an assembly building for communal gatherings. And in fact, the largest structure at the site has been quite thoroughly excavated, leading Chapman and colleagues to conclude that those expecting the architectural and artifactual reflections of a hierarchical society with elites ruling over thousands of inhabitants in the Tripilia megasite will be disappointed. Couldn't find them. Pollen cores taken around the perimeter of Nebelivka reveal a surprisingly light ecological footprint, which some experts take as evidence of sporadic, maybe seasonal occupation, while others consider if the inhabitants of ancient Nebelivka may have developed sustainable forms of land management, consistent with the striking diversity of botanical and formal assemblages. These suggest relatively small-scale cultivation of cereals, combined with a wide spectrum of herding, hunting, and foraging activities distributed around the year. This too has generated much debate, as has the more provocative suggestion by scientists at the University of Kiel that the formation of the rich black soils under which the megasites are buried, and we're talking here about the very famous Chernozen soils, some of the black earths, some of the most fertile soils in the entire world, that the formation of these soils actually postdates the foundation of the megasites. And moreover, they argue in this journal, Geoderma, and moreover, that the formation of the soils was accelerated by the presence of these sites and their subsequent decay. In which case, we would be confronted with a large-scale form of human settlement that actually enhances the vitality of the land it occupies. Not to mention the historical irony that what ancient Greek writers would later call the barbarian steppe, a land supposedly given over to wild nature and uncivilized nomadic peoples, might turn out to be largely or significantly a cultural creation, anthropogenic in nature, or even the legacy of an urban civilization that was already long forgotten by the time of Herodotus. Now, rather than taking clear sides in all these debates, our exhibition draws attention to two overarching themes. Firstly, the changing nature of archaeological evidence and technical field-based approaches and procedures through which past urban phenomena are apprehended from roughly the time of Childe's famous essay on the urban revolution to the present day. So we begin, and these are all images from Childe's essay, we begin with a certain type of colonial archaeology characterized by the almost industrial scale of earth removal that you see here, illustrated by the site of Harappa in modern-day Pakistan, which precluded, of course, any careful investigation of soft building materials like unbaked mud brick, and often involved the wholesale destruction of more ephemeral layers of architecture to produce images of settlement forms that were largely new creations, compressing multiple historical phases into these flat ground plans, illustrated here again by the site of Warqa in southern Iraq. And then how such plans were raised into 3 dimensions through the kinds of axonometric models ubiquitous in publications of that time, roughly the middle of the 20th century. In Jim Scott's terms, this style of urban archaeology made legible, or even in some cases created, powerful images of state surveillance and control, giving testimony to a causal link between the growth of cities and the growth of centralized power, a cogenesis of the city and the state. We then take, this is the exhibition, bits of it, we then take the Ukrainian megasite of Nebelivka as a lens through which to explore how contemporary understandings of urbanization are transformed by new ways of seeing, generated by analytical sensibilities that focus on the properties of soil and sediment, not just as containers for archaeological data, but as archives in their own right, including we made this sort of digital soil, which is actually based on micromorphological data obtained from the site by my colleague Manuel Arreola, which in the installation you can see actually morphing and changing through worm action in a dynamic sequence that leads to the formation of dark earths. So by reversing the figure-ground relation of traditional archaeology, field archaeology, we try to consider what can be learned when that logic of unearthing, the extraction, cleansing, and purification of objects from the soil shifts towards a much gentler, less invasive practice, tuned to the materiality of the soil itself. And the result, maybe a bit too pretentious, but it's a sort of anti-museum, where no objects are on display, but actually it's the densities and the textures of that viscous black earth on the Ukrainian steppe that takes center stage in a kind of top-down projection, which creates a sort of theatre that people can interact with. Surface depth relations revealed through subsoil scans frame a series of propositions about the possibilities of human coexistence with the land. Now, what I want to share with you by way of conclusion, since I can't really convey very well the nature of the installation, is actually an early draft of the tool, there it goes, that we developed to simulate multiple possibilities in the life and growth of this single site. So what you're looking at here is a speedrun of the procedural prototype designed by Davide Pischitelli of Forensic Architecture, where possible distributions and spreads of buildings are generated with attention to the changing status of individual dwellings, those which are burned, because many houses were deliberately burned for reasons not well understood, those which are not burned, and it all happens through a set of rules that consider the spatial organization of the site based on its geomagnetic plan. It's a kind of machine, a machine for modeling the indeterminacies of the data, and the possibilities that they introduce, adding parameters along the way. So the next thing we did was add the radiocarbon database as a further variable. And in that way, we developed an algorithm to simulate the city's possible patterns of use, growth, and decline, generating a series of reconstructions, speculative, but respecting the constraints of spatial and chronometric data. In this way, a spectrum of possible transformations reveals itself through that data. For example, a shift between circumferential and radial logics as the inhabitants of Megalithka explore alternative modes of coexistence. I do see what we're doing here as, in a way, analogous to what David and I attempted on a much coarser and broader scale in The Dawn of Everything. In the book, we surveyed an array of past urban forms to query non-aesthetic approaches to scale change. Here, we see how, by working within the constraints of a single data set, a multiplicity of possible urban worlds can be shown to coexist at the very same site. Now, of course, only a few of the pathways that you're seeing here will actually have been taken, but all of them could present themselves to conscious historical actors as viable alternatives in the remote past. And maybe this also helps to move us beyond rather condescending ideas of prehistoric architecture as being either symbolic of some perfectly formulated cosmology or worldview, or merely adapting to its environment, which is a strangely modernist idea where form is meant to follow function in an almost mechanical way, devoid of experimentation or error, politics or play. And in that sense, this is also a preliminary attempt to explore what an archaeology of freedom might actually look like. That is, to represent in visual terms evidence for the collective workings of sapient minds over a period of centuries, thinking and acting in concert, exploring alternative modes of coexistence, moving, disobeying, seeking consensus, enacting what David Graeber and I refer to as the third freedom. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to David. It was clear, as we've seen here today, that right from the beginning of his career, that David was an exceptionally clear-sighted thinker, and also that he was astonishingly unconstrained by the disciplinary boundaries, traditions and frameworks of interpretation which have been so prevalent in many of our fields. He's an exceptional communicator, and as we've seen today, moving beyond archaeological sort of collaborations, moving outside that, working with people in other fields, and also people putting on exhibitions, architects, etc. His written work is astonishingly beautiful to read. He has a turn of phrase that sometimes makes you think that you're actually really not reading academic work. This is really astonishing literature. But it's also not just about the theory and the turn of phrase for him. He is an incisive, careful, and convincing interpreter of primary data in his quest to answer big questions about societal structures and inequality. He has been resolutely comparative throughout his approach, even sort of in the 1990s when this was not really what many people were doing. He was actually really thinking broadly. On the reach of his ideas and evidentiary basis, you can see expanding outwards throughout in space and time throughout his career. From the ancient Near East to his more recent collaboration with David Graeber in The Dawn of Everything, which has to be one of the most fascinating, controversial, and surprisingly upbeat academic works of recent years. In a world where modern governments and institutions seem resolutely bent on upholding social and climate inequality, it is a joy to see archaeology contributing positively to broader political and intellectual debates. And let's hope others listen as enthusiastically as we have today. So on behalf of our Director and Deputy Director, I would like to invite all of you to join us for drinks in the McDonald Institute on the Downing site after this lecture. But right now I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking David Wengrow for a really illuminating and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you very much, David.